The battle that made the Ottomans terrified of the Greeks, 1825. Fire, ash, silence. On Palm Sunday, 1826, a city of ghosts decided to die, not by sword, not by starvation, but by their own hand, turning their bodies into the final ammunition of a war they could not win. Picture this: 10,000 skeletons walking into the guns of 30,000 well-fed soldiers, their eyes burning with a fever that was not disease, but defiance. They called it the Exodus. It wasn't a battle. It was a funeral procession that fought back, a mass suicide pact signed in gunpowder and blood. By the end of this video, you will see how a single explosion in a mud brick town didn't just kill the defenders. It woke up the entire world, shaking the chandeliers in the palaces of Europe. Missolonghi fell so Greece could rise. But first, they had to pay the ultimate price in blood. To understand how a graveyard became a symbol of freedom, we must first understand the terror that was strangling the Greek Revolution. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Today, we are going to walk the blood-soaked mud of the Missolonghi Lagoon. We will smell the sulfur of the powder magazines and the rot of a starving city. We will witness the forensic reality of what happens when a human being is pushed beyond the limits of endurance and decides that death is not a defeat, but a weapon. This is the story of the free besieged, the men and women who taught an empire to fear the dead. By 1825, the dream of independence was dying. It wasn't dying a hero's death, it was rotting in the sun. Civil wars had drained the treasury, leaving the soldiers unpaid and the government fractured. European powers looked on with indifference, seeing only a chaotic uprising of peasants against a legitimate, if brutal, empire. The Ottoman Empire, tired of the rebellion that had dragged on for 4 years, had played its trump card. The Sultan called upon his most powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, to finish what the Turks could not. The Sultan didn't just ask for soldiers, he asked for an executioner who would not hesitate to sever the head of the rebellion. Enter Ibrahim Pasha. If the Ottoman commanders were old-school medieval warlords relying on feudal levies, Ibrahim was the future. Cold, calculated, European in his methods, if not his heart. His army had been trained by French veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, men who had marched with the emperor and knew the science of slaughter. They didn't charge in disorganized mobs screaming religious slogans. They marched in step, a single organism of destruction. They wore uniforms. They used the bayonet with mathematical precision. This wasn't a horde. This was a machine. Consider the contrast. The Ottoman forces had spent 4 years failing to crush the Greeks because they fought the same way the Greeks did. Guerrilla skirmishes, mountain ambushes, chaotic melees where individual bravery mattered more than discipline. Ibrahim brought the discipline of the West to the brutality of the East. He landed in the Peloponnese and simply erased opposition, sweeping across the land like a plague of locusts. He burned olive groves, destroying the economic future of the region. He enslaved villages, shipping the population to the markets of Cairo. He turned the Garden of Greece into a desert. His strategy was brutally simple. If you cannot catch the fish, drain the water. By late 1825, this unstoppable force turned its eyes north to the one city that had defied the Sultan for years, Missolonghi. On a map, Missolonghi makes no sense as a fortress. It isn't built on a crag like Corinth, dominating the landscape. It isn't surrounded by massive stone walls like Rhodes, built by knights to withstand centuries of siege. It is a fishing town sitting flat on a muddy lagoon, vulnerable to the tides. It barely rises above sea level. From a distance, it looks like a collection of shacks sinking into the swamp, a temporary settlement that forgot to leave. Military logic said it should have fallen in a day. The walls were often nothing more than dried mud and earthen ramparts, barely high enough to stop a determined horse, let alone a cannonball. The moat was a shallow ditch filled with stagnant water and mosquito larvae. A concerted artillery barrage should have turned the entire settlement into dust. A single heavy cavalry charge should have ridden over the earthworks, but the lagoon was the city's shield and its secret. The waters around Missolonghi are a treacherous maze of shallows, silt banks, and islets, a navigational nightmare. Deep draft Ottoman warships couldn't get close enough to bombard the town effectively. They would run aground miles out, helpless turtles in the mud. Only small, flat-bottomed boats could navigate the labyrinth. This meant that any assault had to be amphibious, slow, and exposed to the withering fire of the defenders. Inside this mud fence stood the free besieged, a collection of locals, refugees, and the remnants of the Suliotes, the legendary mountain warriors of Epirus who had been fighting the Turks for generations. These men were living anachronisms. While Ibrahim's army was practicing formation drills and cleaning their muskets by the numbers, the Suliotes were cleaning their yataghans and singing songs about Alexander the Great. They wore the fustanella, the pleated kilt, and fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They had no artillery corps to calculate trajectories. They had no supply lines to bring fresh uniforms. They had no uniforms at all. What they had was a complete, terrifying lack of fear, a contempt for death that unnerved even the bravest enemy. The strategic situation in early 1826 was a nightmare. Reshid Pasha, the Ottoman commander known as Kiyotachis, had been banging his head against Missolonghi's mud walls for months with little success. His army was demoralized, unpaid, and suffering from the swamp fever that plagued the lagoon, rotting them from the inside out. The defenders had mocked him from the walls, calling out insults in Turkish. They had raided his camps at night, stealing horses and heads. They had turned the siege into a stalemate. Then, Ibrahim arrived. The arrival of the Egyptian fleet changed the physics of the war. 135 ships darkened the horizon, a forest of masts that blocked out the sun. Transport vessels disgorged regiment after regiment of fresh, disciplined infantry. Arab lancers, French-trained artillerymen, Mamluk cavalry. The combined force facing the town swelled to over 30,000 men, a city of tents encircling the town of mud. Inside the walls, barely 4,000 exhausted fighters and 10,000 women, children, and elderly. The odds were 7-1. The outcome seemed mathematically inevitable. Ibrahim rode out to meet Reshid Pasha. The meeting was tense, a clash of old and new worlds. The Egyptian commander looked at the ragged Ottoman siege lines, then looked at the pathetic mud fence of the city. He laughed. He reportedly told Reshid that he wouldn't need months. He would take the fence in 14 days. He was wrong. The siege began not with an assault, but with engineering. Ibrahim's French advisors laid out a grid of trenches and drawing geometric lines of death in the dirt. They approached the walls with the slow, inexorable creep of a glacier. Zigzag patterns to deflect return fire, parallel ditches to protect the sappers, battery positions to house the heavy guns. They were bringing the science of the siege to a knife fight. The first bombardments were apocalyptic. Thousands of shells rained down on the thatched roofs of Missolonghi, turning the night sky into a kaleidoscope of fire. The city burned. Smoke hung low over the lagoon, mixing with the morning mist, creating a toxic fog. The defenders dove into cellars or huddled behind the earthworks, clutching their icons. But when the shelling stopped and the Egyptian infantry advanced, they found the Greeks waiting. This is where the difference between parade ground drills and swamp warfare became bloody apparent. Ibrahim sent his Arab regulars forward in tight columns, bayonets fixed. They marched into the kill zone with perfect discipline, but the mud of the lagoon neutralized their speed, sucking at their boots like quicksand. The uneven ground broke their formations, and from behind the earthworks, the Greek fire was withering. The Suliotes didn't fire in volleys. They didn't waste powder. They fired at will. Every shot aimed by a marksman who had learned to shoot hunting mountain goats on the Restatian, crags of Epirus. They targeted officers, the men shouting orders. They targeted standard bearers, the men holding the flags. The Egyptian columns wavered as their leadership was methodically erased. Then the Greeks did the unthinkable. They didn't just hold the line. They jumped over the wall. Yataghan, drawn, pistol in one hand, dagger in the other, screaming war cries that curdled the blood. The defenders charged into the muddy no-man's land. The psychological impact was devastating. Ibrahim's soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers. Men who stood in lines and fired on command, not demons who sprinted through artillery fire to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The modern bayonet is a clumsy weapon in a mud pit. It is too long, too unwieldy. The short Greek swords were efficient butchers, designed for close work. In those early weeks, the lagoon turned red. Ibrahim's 14-day promise evaporated in the smoke of the cannons. He threw wave after wave at the walls. He tried night attacks. He tried mining the walls to blow them up from below. Every time the result was the same. The fence held. The defenders began to believe they were invincible. They mocked Ibrahim from the ramparts, just as they had mocked Reshid. They called him the Arab, the Arab, daring him to come closer, taunting him to step into the meat grinder. They felt the eyes of Europe on them. Lord Byron had died in this very town just 2 years prior, cementing Missolonghi as the romantic heart of the Greek cause, the altar upon which the poet had sacrificed himself. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for an idea. But Ibrahim was not a man to be baited by insults. He was a mathematician of death. He realized that brute force was expensive. He was losing hundreds of unmatched soldiers for every dozen Greeks he killed. The exchange rate was poor, a bad investment. So he stopped. The guns fell silent. The charges ceased. The Egyptian army pulled back just out of musket range. Settling into a menacing stillness, Ibrahim looked at the lagoon. He looked at the supply boats sneaking in from the Ionian Islands under the cover of darkness, silent shadows bringing bread and gunpowder to the defenders. He realized his mistake. He had been trying to break the wall. He needed to break the stomach. The order went out. No more charges. No more glory. The fleet moved to block the sea lanes, a wooden wall across the water. The engineers were put to work sealing the channels with sunken hulks and piles driven into the mud. The strategy shifted from assault to suffocation. The anvil was in place. Now Ibrahim would slowly, patiently lower the hammer. The city of Missolonghi was about to learn that hunger is a slower, crueler weapon than the sword. The battles of February had been a test of courage. The coming months would be a test of biology. The heroics of the sword were over. The horror of the empty belly was about to begin. The war for the city became a war for the water. Ibrahim knew that as long as the lagoon remained open, Missolonghi would never fall. The town wasn't an island, but it breathed through the sea. Small Greek boats maneuvering through the silt channels like water striders brought ammunition from the Ionian Islands and food from the Peloponnese. They were the umbilical cord keeping the rebellion alive. To strangle the city, Ibrahim had to sever the cord. The geography of the lagoon was defined by a chain of tiny islets, mud banks barely rising above the waves, fortified with primitive earthworks and wooden palisades. These were the gatekeepers: Vasilati, Dolmas, Kleisova, If Ibrahim took these, he controlled the flow of food. He started with Vasiladi. It wasn't a fortress. It was a glorified mound of dirt housing a few dozen defenders and some rusted cannons, but it commanded the main channel. On February 25th, the Egyptian machine went to work. A massive bombardment pulverized the earthworks, turning the soil into a cratered moonscape. Then, a swarm of flat-bottomed assault boats, specially built for the shallows, overwhelmed the stunned survivors. Vasiladi fell. The first knot in the noose was tied. Next came Dolmas. The fighting was savage. Hand to hand, in knee-deep water, men drowning each other in the muck. The Greeks fought until their ammunition ran dry, then fought with stones and gun stocks. But the weight of numbers was mathematical and absolute. Dolmas fell. The defenders inside Missolonghi watched the smoke rise from the lagoon. They saw their outer defenses crumbling one by one. The umbilical cord was being squeezed, but there was one islet left. The most important one, Klaisova. If Missolonghi was the heart of the resistance, Klaisova was the fist. It was defended by 130 men, not soldiers. 130 ragged, starving, exhausted men led by Kitsos Tsavelas, a Suliote warlord who treated warfare like a personal vendetta against the Ottoman bloodline. They had a primitive rampart and the mud beneath their feet. Against them, Ibrahim sent everything. He was frustrated. The siege was dragging on. He wanted to crush this last annoyance and march into the city. On March 25th, the anniversary of the revolution's outbreak, he launched a combined assault. It was overkill. It was hubris. It was a massacre, but not the one he expected. Picture the scene. The waters around Klaisova are shallow, a treacherous mix of mud and silt. Ibrahim's boats ran aground hundreds of yards from the islet. His soldiers, the elite of the Egyptian army, had to jump into the water. They were carrying muskets, ammunition, and bayonets. The water was waist deep. The mud sucked at their boots. They were slow, exposed, and helpless. From the ramparts of Klaisova, the 130 defenders didn't panic. They waited. They waited until they could see the whites of the Egyptians' eyes. They waited until they could hear the officers shouting orders. Then they opened fire. It wasn't a battle. It was a turkey shoot. The Egyptians couldn't run. The water was too deep. They couldn't duck. There was no cover. They couldn't charge. The mud held them fast. They simply died. Wave after wave of attackers waded into the Red Lagoon. Bodies began to pile up in the water, creating gruesome floating barricades that the next wave had to push aside to get to. Their own deaths. The water turned a thick, opaque crimson. Ibrahim, watching from his flagship, flew into a rage. This defied all military logic. How could 130 men stop an army? He ordered his officers to lead the charge personally. They died. He ordered a diversionary attack on the city itself to draw fire away. It failed. Finally, in a fit of desperation, Ibrahim himself jumped into a boat to rally his men. He got close enough to the fighting to feel the heat. A Greek bullet found his leg. The conqueror of the Morea, the man who had terrified the Ottoman Empire, was wounded by a peasant on a mud bank. By sunset, the guns fell silent. The toll was catastrophic. Historical estimates vary, but the numbers are insane. Over 2,500 Ottoman and Egyptian soldiers lay dead or wounded in the same lagoon. The defenders of Klaisova, they lost roughly 35 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. A tactical miracle inside Missolonghi. The church bells rang, they sang songs of victory. For a brief shining moment, they believed they had won. They thought Ibrahim was broken, but they were wrong. Ibrahim wasn't broken, he was just done playing games. The Battle of Klaisova proved that he couldn't take the city by force without bleeding his army dry. The cost was too high, so he returned to his original plan. If he couldn't kill them with lead, he would kill them with emptiness. The victory at Klaisova paradoxically sealed Missolonghi's fate. It forced Ibrahim to fully commit to the blockade. He brought in a fleet of new, smaller gunboats that could navigate the shallows completely. He linked them together with chains and floating booms. He patrolled the waters 24 hours a day. By the first week of April, the seal was airtight. Inside the walls, the heroics of Klaisova faded into the grim reality of biology. The city had been under siege for a year. The stockpiles were long gone. The cats and dogs had disappeared months ago. Now the famine began in earnest. It started with the donkeys and the horses. These were prized animals, essential for work. But hunger has no economy. They were slaughtered and boiled. Then came the mules. When the livestock was gone, the diet turned to the grotesque. We have diaries from the survivors. They read like a descent into madness. They boiled leather shoes to soften the hide and drank the broth, desperate for any protein. They ate the oil-soaked rags used to clean rifles. They scavenged the lagoon for seaweed, boiling the salty kelp until it was a gray slime. They hunted mice and rats with the same intensity they hunted Turks. Scurvy swept through the population like a plague. Gums bled, teeth fell out, old wounds reopened as the body consumed itself to stay alive. Men who could sprint up a mountain in full armor a month ago now needed a walking stick to cross the town square. But here is where it gets insane. They didn't surrender. Ibrahim knew they were starving. He sent envoys to the walls. He didn't offer death. He offered mercy. He offered food. "Surrender!" the messengers shouted. "The Pasha admires your courage. He will let you live. He will let you leave. Just open the gates." Imagine the temptation. The smell of roasting meat wafting from the Ottoman lines. The cries of your own children. Their bellies distended from starvation, begging for bread. All you have to do is open a wooden gate and the pain stops. The answer from the walls was silence or a single gunshot. The defenders had entered a psychological state that transcended logic. They called it the Brotherhood of Hunger. Suffering became a badge of honor. To eat was to be weak. To starve was to be free. They held councils where skeletal commanders debated strategy while chewing on boiled leather straps. The civilian population suffered the most. Mothers stopped producing milk. Infants died in silence, their energy too depleted even to cry. The graveyards were full, so they buried the dead in backyards, in cellars, in the streets. The smell of the city changed. It wasn't just gunpowder and mud anymore. It was the sweet, sickly scent of slow death. By mid-April, the situation was terminal. The Swiss newspaper editor, Johann Jakob Meyer, who was inside the city publishing a chronicle of the siege, wrote his final dispatch. It is one of the most haunting letters in history. "We are reduced to the most dire extremity," he wrote. "We are eating the most unclean things. We are suffering from hunger, thirst, and disease. But in the name of God, we remain firm. We will die free." Meyer knew he was writing his own obituary. He wasn't asking for help. He knew help wasn't coming. He was documenting a crime scene. The leadership of the city, the Bishop Rogan Joseph, the warlords Notis Batsaris and Kitsos Tseveles gathered for a final council. They looked at their men. The warriors were ghosts. Their eyes were sunken, their skin paper thin. They couldn't lift their heavy muskets anymore. They were leaning against the walls, watching the Egyptian campfires, waiting for the end. A decision had to be made. They could stay. If they stayed, they would die of starvation within a week. They would be too weak to fight. Or they could surrender. Or they could do the impossible. Whispers began to circulate through the starving town. They wouldn't wait for Ibrahim to come to them. They wouldn't wait to die in the mud. They would walk out. All of them. The men, the women, the children, the wounded. The entire population of Missolonghi would open the gates, march across the plain, and cut a road through 30,000 enemy soldiers to the mountains beyond. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only choice left. The date was set for the night of April 10th, Palm Sunday. The irony was not lost on them. The day of Christ's entry into Jerusalem would be the day of their exit into eternity. Inside the walls, the preparations began in silence. Women tore up their remaining clothes to make bandages. Men sharpened their yataghans for the last time. Those too sick or wounded to walk were moved to the stone houses near the powder magazines. They knew they couldn't make the journey. They were being prepared for a different role. The city held its breath. The hunger was forgotten. The pain was forgotten. There was only the terrifying clarity of the end. The anvil of the blockade had done its work. The hammer of the assault was poised. But the metal between them was about to shatter in a way the world had never seen. The sun set on Palm Sunday, the 10th of April, 1826. It was a sunset, the color of a bruise, dark purple and angry red. Inside the walls of Missolonghi, the silence was heavier than the artillery fire that had pounded them for a year. The decision had been made. The orders had been whispered. The exodus was not a retreat. It was an assault. The plan was a masterpiece of desperation. The survivors were divided into 3 columns. The first 2 were the spearheads, fighting men, the remnants of the garrisons, the hardest of the Suliotes. Their job was to punch a hole through the Ottoman siege lines. They would act as human battering rams. The third column was the soul of the city. In the center walked the women, the children, the elderly who could still move, and the few civilians who hadn't died of starvation. They were placed in the middle of a protective square of soldiers. But what about those who couldn't walk? This is the darkest chapter of the night. There were hundreds of wounded, sick, and crippled lying in the ruins of the houses. They couldn't move. They knew they would be left behind. The scenes of parting were biblical in their tragedy. Fathers kissing dying sons goodbye. Wives choosing to stay with wounded husbands rather than save themselves. The leadership made a grim calculation. To leave the sick to the mercy of the Turks was a death sentence, likely involving torture. So they concentrated the immovable in the strongest stone houses and the powder, magazines. They gave them loaded muskets and a torch. Their orders were simple. Wait for the enemy to enter, then send them to hell. Christos Kapsalis, a venerable elder of the city, took command of the largest magazine. He was a man of peace who prepared for an act of supreme violence. He gathered the sick, the women who refused to leave, and the old men. They sat on kegs of gunpowder. They began to sing funeral dirges while they were still alive. At 7 p.m., a hush fell over the town. The Bishop Rogan Joseph performed the final rites. There was no bread for communion, so he blessed them with his tears. The gates were unbarred. The bridges, makeshift structures of wood and debris, were lowered silently over the moat. The plan relied on one thing: surprise. They needed to cross the open plain, reach the enemy trenches, and break through before the Ottoman machine could wake up. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. History tells us that a deserter, a Bulgarian mercenary who had been fighting for the Greeks, slipped out of the city hours before the Exodus. He went straight to Ibrahim's tent. He told him everything: the time, the route, the plan. Ibrahim didn't panic. He smiled. He didn't attack the city. He simply moved his pieces on the chessboard. He reinforced the exact sector where the Greeks planned to strike. He positioned his artillery to create a kill zone. At 8 p.m., the first column moved out. They moved like ghosts, their feet wrapped in rags to stifle the sound. The moon was obscured by clouds, offering a blessed cloak of darkness. They crossed the moat. They crossed the open ground. They reached the first line of Ottoman trenches. Silence. The Greek vanguard thought they had succeeded. They crept forward, yataghans drawn, ready to slit the throats of sleeping sentries. Then a single musket shot rang out. It was the signal. Suddenly, the night evaporated. Flares and torches were lit along the entire Ottoman line. The darkness was replaced by a blinding, flickering light, and from the darkness came the thunder. Ibrahim's artillery, pre-sighted on the bridges and the open plain, opened fire simultaneously. Canister shot cans filled with musket balls that turn a cannon into a giant shotgun tore through the Greek columns. The silence was replaced by a cacophony of screaming metal and screaming men. But the Greeks did not stop. They roared, "Eleftheria! Freedom!" and charged. Inside the city, every house became a fortress. Wounded men fired from windows until they were killed. Women threw rocks from rooftops. But the end was inevitable. The flood of Ottoman soldiers was unstoppable. They pushed the defenders back street by street towards the center, towards the stone houses where the immovable were waiting. Christos Kapsalis sat in the dark of the magazine. He could hear the screams getting closer. He checked the fuse of his torch. The door burst open. Ottoman soldiers poured in, shouting in triumph. Kapsalis didn't hesitate. He simply lowered the torch. The explosion was tectonic. It wasn't just a boom. It was an erasure. The blast wave threw bodies, Greek and Turk alike, hundreds of yards into the lagoon. Kapsalis took hundreds of the enemy with him. It wasn't the only one. Across the city, the same scene played out. The Bishop Rogan Joseph, barricaded in the windmill, set fire to the powder kegs. Boom. Another house! Boom! The city of Missolonghi committed suicide rather than surrender. If you want to explore more topics on history and uncover the untold stories of the past with medieval spirits, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more insights.